Today is March 24th, 2022, and my guest is economist and author Chris Blattman of the University of Chicago. This is Chris's fourth appearance on EconTalk. He was last here in July of 2017, talking about chickens, cash, development. Our topic for today is his book, Why We Fight, The Roots of War and the Paths to Peace. Chris, welcome back to EconTalk.
Thanks for having me.
How did this book come about? Why did you write a book on, of all things, on war?
Well, I've been working on the subject for myself. I mean, it seems far from chickens and cash. Maybe it's worth saying chickens and cash was a little bit of a detour for me. I was working in conflict zones from about 2004 and initially working on how to relieve the worst effects of war on kids, on families, on those, especially those who had been participating in the war. And so that got me down a path, a part of my research of just trying to figure out what works in terms of poverty alleviation in these extreme scenarios. And turns out these post-conflict scenarios aren't that different than just a lot of other poor places. And so that got me into this general, how do we relieve poverty? But all this time, one is when you're in these places, you can't help but think or wonder all the time, what is going on? Why is this happening? Why did this even occur in the first place? And I was an economist. I was also a political scientist, and slowly, pretty quickly, really, but slowly, most of my research turned to understanding who participates, why do people fight, why are individuals violent, and then more and more, why are groups violent? And I just learned all these amazing things. There's just a lot out there. People have studied this. There's a lot of deep insights. It makes a lot of sense. And then slowly I realized, actually, nobody else seems to know about this stuff. This is like all these things that rotated my brain 90 degrees and then 90 degrees again until my brain was just spinning with information. And no one had brought this to a general audience before, which seemed kind of a shame. And that's something I liked to do with the blog. And so I thought, well, somebody has to do this. It's been 20, 30, 40 years. Somebody has to do it. So I decided to take a shot.
It's cool. I was recently talking to Dwayne Betts, the poet and author, about, we were talking about, it hasn't aired yet, but Primo Levi's book, If This Is a Man, and followed by The Truce. And then also Ralph Ellison's book, Invisible Man, which is a novel. But both of those books inevitably deal with the cruelty that people can take out on each other, the violence that people use. And it's deeply troubling that there's something inside us. But your book tries to go beyond that. I
want to jump in, and you know this just because I told you about this very recently, but what maybe the listeners don't know is the reason I started writing it now. I was wondering about, I really should write this at some point. And so we were talking about chickens and cash, and you said, what are you doing next? And I thought, maybe I'll write a book about this bigger topic I've been working on. And you said something along the lines of, well, I'm not that young and I'll be dead if you wait too much longer. And so we hung up the phone or whatever we were on, because back then I don't think we used Zoom. And it was a June day in the University of Chicago, sitting in the Siri office, and it's June, so that the semester's over, right? And it's like, well, why don't I just try putting some words down on a page? I'm gonna listen to Russ, And I started writing, and then I decided actually what I would do is I wanted it to be conversational. I wanted it to sound like I was talking to people. So I decided I'd walk around the Midway, which is this park over here, the long, lengthy park next to the university. And I'd just talk it out loud on my phone with Google dictation or something. And I wrote dozens and dozens of pages over the next few weeks. Now, it was all garbage. That was just complete garbage. It's the wrong way to write a book. But it got me started. And so that's the long path to having the book come out a few weeks from today.
So it's my fault. I'm really happy about that. Seriously, I'd love to.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's like, it's too creepy. I was going to say it's like I'm a surrogate dad, but never mind. It had something to do with the birthing of this book.
You're a muse.
Yeah, a muse. I'll take that. So this book is a tradition that I both love and am suspicious of, which is using the economic toolkit, the Economist toolkit, to understand various forms of human behavior. Before we go into the specifics of how you frame the problem, I'd like you to talk about what we might call a meta issue in this kind of work, which is that when we talk about incentives, you and I face incentives all the time, financial incentives, psychological incentives, and that's the bread and butter of much of economics work. Nations are a little more complicated because although it's easy to say Ukraine is resisting the Russian invasion or Russia invaded Ukraine, it of course is not, a nation is not an actor, a single unified purposive creature. It can be productive to think of nations that way, but talk about how you think about that issue and how your book deals with that.
Yeah, I mean, first, just one comment on the Economist toolkit. I think that's true. I think there's a lot of that in there, but I think a lot of political scientists pick up this book and they say, "Oh, this is our toolkit," and to a lesser extent, but because it's certainly there, I think sociologists and psychologists should pick up this book and think, "Oh, we kind of know this." Like, my hope is that a lot of these people would look at a single chapter from this discipline or that discipline and say, "Oh, we know this. This is, there's nothing new here," which is a little bit true for them. But then they'd look at this other chapter and they'd say, "Oh, what is that all about?" And I think that's so I try to, a lot of my research and my own training is sort of sat at this intersection. And so I'd like to think the book is at this intersection. And some sort of political economy toolkit might be dominant, but I'd say it's not. Hopefully everybody feels a little ownership of this because that's kind of the goal. There's some originality in my synthesis, but Jim Scott, I think, who's one of my idols, in one of his books, I think he writes in the preface, there's no single original idea in this book. There's just nothing. And I actually had that in my preface. I think my publishers were persuaded me to take it out because they're like, "Listen, you can think that, but don't say it out loud." So I say it in coded ways. But anyway, so that's maybe one thought. And I think that sort of leads us into why I think psychology and sociology and a lot of political science is thought about bureaucratic decision-making and group decision-making. Economists do too, right? We think about principal agent problems. And I think principal agent problems are really at the center of this book. That's like the big, I think there's sort of two ways that I thought about this. One is I think you have to take what economists call these principal agent problems. The fact that like a group can't really necessarily control its decision maker, right? We see that going on with, say, autocrats today and Putin's invasion of Ukraine. This isn't, the people of Russia invading Ukraine. This is a cronyistic elite with some popular support, but by no means all. So we have to think about that. But then there's also this question, and I think it's maybe under-researched and I learned a lot reading this literature, but I still think there's huge gaps, which is to say, a lot of people are very quick to say, "Oh, so-and-so miscalculated," right? That's the classic explanation for World War I, which is, the foibles of these unaccountable leaders marched Europe into war. They slept walk into war. So, and people are the narrative that Putin, for example, is the master strategist playing 400-dimensional chess, has disappeared overnight. And it was just his foibles. But the problem with these narratives is there's a few problems. I give them some credence. I think there's a lot of behavioral, sort of psychological miscalculations, things that go on, and I talk about those. But they sort of personalize it too much. We like to do this, right? We like to over-personalize groups and sort of by their leaders, and over-attribute mistakes. And that's not true, right? We have these big bureaucracies. There's at least, even if Putin runs a militarized state, a personalized state, there's a huge military and political bureaucracy and a set of cronies. Like, there's a big coalition that has a say, and they can't all be stupid and making all the same mistakes all the time. And so this book, I think, forced me to think more about what are the mistakes we make in groups and in group thinking and bureaucracies, and draw on that literature. And I learned a lot. But yeah, it's, this is maybe for me the biggest gap in probably political science and sociology. Is lots of work's been done, but there's lots we still don't know.
Yeah, the easiest explanation for anything that is puzzling is, well, it's a mistake.
Yeah.
Not a helpful explanation, although it could be true, of course. We understand people do miscalculate. They are overconfident. They make all of us make these kinds of mistakes all the time. But of course, there are often very strong forces working to make decisions that are maybe not mistakes. And if we always assume everybody's crazy, we're not going to be very good at preventing future wars, for example.
I would say my view of, like, it's funny. There's this weird bifurcation. I think political economists and some realists in a lot of international relations scholars are really quick to overweight a lot of these systematic root, like, strategic forces, which I think are really important, and then they totally discount any of the psychological stuff.
Sure.
Whether it's mistakes or whether it's just what people have as principles or values. And then everybody else, you pick up an account and there's just a mass, it's a slight exaggeration to mass ignorance of strategic forces, but just a lack of appreciation of maybe of when they're there, and a complete overestimation of how important these psychological forces are. And I don't. It's just been going on for so long. And never the twain meet. And it's puzzling to me why we sort of everybody keeps making the same mistakes over and over again.
Different, yeah. Well, those are scholars, not actors in the real world.
Well, but the actors in the real world, I think, are the ones who are making that, like the journalists and the policymakers and the armchair analysts. But the people in the room, I think, are often overestimating these psychological forces. They're certainly important. I don't want to dismiss one or the other.
I think it gets I'll say one more thing and then we'll get into the book, but it strikes me in this current conflict that we're recording this a month into 4 weeks into the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And I think one of the common mistakes people make in trying to understand it is assuming that Vladimir Putin is something like them. He's not. He's not like you. He's a Russian, which most people in the West literally don't understand. Mm-hmm. He is a former KGB person that you don't understand. He is the member of a former Soviet Union set of actors who have all kinds of chips on their shoulders and baggage and that you don't understand. So when one opines about this man in any direction, you should do it carefully because he's not like you. And I think so many people, when they confront a situation like this, think, well, what would I wouldn't have done that. And I want to always say, yeah, he's not you. he's not. I'll say one more thing and then I'll let you react to this and then we'll get to the book. But I think it's really important to remember the words of the poet Hilaire Belloc, who wrote, I think it's called Pacifism. It's a very short poem. Pale Ebenezer thought it wrong to fight, but Roaring Bill, who killed him, thought it right. Some people have different attitudes toward violence, toward honor, toward territory, toward culture, toward their homeland, toward their nation than you do, Mr. or Ms. Public intellectual. And it's easy to forget that. I think so many people, those armchair folks, just forget that all the time.
When we talk about these psychological roots, one sort of big bucket that I think of is of these misperceptions, I think, which, is a term gifted to us by many, great political psychologists, including Bob Jervis. But I think one of the things that really struck me as I read account after account after account of different conflicts at different levels, whether it's gang wars or insurgencies or international wars, is this thing that we're really bad at knowing what other people think. Like, this is not a new insight from behavioral science.
Yeah.
I sort of labeled it projection bias, which is we tend to project our own preferences and project our own beliefs onto other people in a way that's incredibly stubborn.
Yeah.
Right. And the time that brought that home to me, I have a friend who is written several books in the IRA, the provisional IRA in particular, this insurgent group. Most people are at least passingly familiar with it. And so I went to Richard English. So I went to visit him in Belfast for a few days, and I talked to him, and I talked to many people, involved with the conflict. I toured the city a little bit. And my overall impression, this is, I think, when it really sort of jumped out at me, was how many people thought that their response to some act of violence was just. That they just assumed that, the other side would recognize that this punishment that I'm in, the fact that I'm throwing a bomb at a police station seems like an appropriate response to the latest sort of challenge to me, or the latest sort of injustice that was done to me. And they'll surely understand that I'm not going to escalate things further. And of course, that's not true. And the other side thinks, well, the appropriate thing, everyone will realize that I can't find the person who threw that firebomb, but I can go into this neighborhood and arrest, the 30 or 40 suspects, round them up, beat them up a little bit, put them in jail. Everybody will understand that this is the reasonable. This is the normal response, and of course there's many things going on there, but one of the major ones I think is just a stubborn over decades, like just an inability to sort of say, well, actually, maybe that'll just piss them off more and incite further, anger and vengeance actions. And anyway, so I wholeheartedly agree. In theory, we're usually better at doing that in groups than we are as individuals. But I think this is one of these biases that does time and time again seem to persist in groups.
It's a major part of, I think, growing up and being a successful human being is realizing that not everyone is just like you. Yeah. And I also mentioned in passing a book by Roy Baumeister, past EconTalk guest, called Evil. It is a fabulous book. I confess I have not finished it. I think I read the first 50 or 100 pages. It's now sitting in a warehouse in Maryland waiting to be shipped to my new Israeli address. But I recommend that book because it's exactly about this point, that people often think that something is totally reasonable that other people think is totally evil. So it's a educational experience to read some of the quotes in that book and the stories. So let's get to your book, though, in actual detail. You give 5 reasons for war. What are they? And we'll work through them. Yeah.
Well, I mean, just to explain the 5, I think you have to start with this. I think this insight. Your starting point is just to recognize that war is costly, it's ruinous. We're seeing this now in Russia and Ukraine. It's so ruinous that it very seldom makes sense to fight. This is a game theoretic insight. It's also a commonsensical insight. So Sun Tzu and virtually every general that's written a book on conflict for centuries has in some sense said this, which is that it's better to bargain than fight. And most of the time people do. And so what we have to think about is, like, when is it that the people who are deciding whether, so basically you have a set of objectives that you want to obtain on either side. You have a rival. You have some sort of pie to split. You can decide you can look at each other's relative strength and recognize that there's some split that's feasible that make both of you happy, and you can take that, or you can, destroy a slice of the pie and fight. And then see who gets it. And so the basic insight is that the war is so costly that most of the time you just find that bargain split. And if you skirmish a little, you quickly sort of recognize that this is the wrong path, and then you find another way to do this. So the question is, war. The idea is that war or sustained fighting happens when somehow people overlook that. This gravitational pull that peace has because of these costs. Somehow something rips you out of that orbit. And it seems like there's a reason for every war and a war for every reason. It's just so, Russia and Ukraine is different than what happened in Syria or what happened in Afghanistan and so on. But I think what I realized, which is partly inherited from a bunch of other people who've researched this, but I think I sort of tried to focus it a bit more, is it seemed to me that everything fits in all these explanations for why you would pull away, why these incentives would get hijacked, sort of fall into 5 buckets. And so two of them are really familiar to political economists and game theorists who like to talk about imperfect information, or maybe more broadly, just a lot of an uncertain situation. And they sort of make the point that if you genuinely don't know the strength of your opponent, and they have, in addition, an incentive to bluff, to pretend they're strong in order to get the best deal, on occasion, strategically, your best incentive might be to attack to find out, is one. And anyone who's ever played poker and decided to bluff or call in the face of a bluff sort of understands this logic on an intuitive level, right? Sometimes you win, sometimes you lose. The second is what game theorists, political economists call a commitment problem, which is kind of one of the worst terms in, I think, the discipline, because it's just not very intuitive. One of the best examples is called a preventative war, and I think that's a lot more intuitive to people. The idea is that if your opponent's going to be much stronger in the future, and you could do something to head that off right now, say by invading them and stopping them from doing that, then you'll do so. Now, if you all recognize this, your opponent could say, whoa, okay, before you do that, why don't I promise not to? I'll give you a good deal in the future. Don't worry. When I'm powerful, we'll be fine. Or I'll give up something that's going to make me powerful, just enough to make you not attack me now. And that sometimes happens. In fact, it happens a lot of the time. But when they can't commit to do that, because it's inescapable, or because there's maybe no international architecture will keep you from doing that, that's gonna hinder that. And then you have this quote unquote commitment problem. And so those are these two really deep, I think, important strategic insights that are hard to grasp. And I think one of the reasons people haven't advertised them and brought them out in a general audience as much is because they're hard to explain. And I disagree. I think they're hard. I disagree. I think people can understand them and get them and start to recognize them.
So can we talk about them for a minute before we go on to the others? So let's repeat them again. We've got a miscalculation maybe about the strength of your opponent or your own strength, right? Imperfect information, uncertainty about the real relative strengths of each side, for sure. Yeah. And the second is that you might be able to strike a bargain now, but it requires some kind of deal, promise of the future, which can't be relied on.
Right.
I'm going to call
and both of these are, what they have in common and what's so powerful about them is it says the most rational, there's no mistakes. There's no passion. There's no autocratic Putin taking his group to war against their will. This is when well-intentioned, thoughtful, calculating, deeply, groups can find themselves at war because of these situational circumstances. One of them just being this fundamental uncertainty that's really hard to resolve. And the second just being the key thing of this commitment problem is an large unavoidable power shift where one of the sides can't promise to not abuse their power in future or to take advantage of their power in future. And both of these are really dominant explanations for everything from World War I to the US invasion of Iraq. There's a lot of relevance for understanding Russia-Ukraine. The power shifts there, the rise of Russia vis-a-vis Germany, the rapid rise of Russia vis-a-vis Germany in World War I, the possibility that Saddam Hussein could get a nuclear bomb or other weapons of mass destruction. And in this case, the possibility that Ukraine could grow close to the West and be armed by the West to the point where it maybe has the long-range missiles to harm Russia. All of these none of them, I think, are perfect examples of a commitment problem where the commitment was so impossible and the rise in power was so unavoidable that that's it. We're done. We can explain these three conflicts, but they were really powerful forces that really narrowed the set of, the opportunities to find a deal between the two because those power shifts were happening. And then you layer on that top the uncertainty, right? We can send in weapons inspectors to Iraq and we can say, well, maybe we can be mostly confident that the capability is not there. But how confident, are we 100% confident? Are we 100% confident, not just now, but that it can't be restarted in 6 months or a year or 5 years? Are we pretty confident that Saddam Hussein would like to do this? So you layer in this uncertainty and this commitment problem on top of one another. And I think suddenly you have a set of impersonal, situational forces that just make a peaceful agreement really hard to find. Not impossible. And then all the mistakes and the leader's foibles, which we tend to overestimate, come into play. They're really crucial. But they're only crucial because the space for finding the deal was actually quite small.
And I just want to reiterate a couple of basic ideas here in the book, which I love. Most of the time, there isn't a war. Nations that don't get along don't fight all the time because each side does realize that there's an enormous cost. Even when you win the war.
There's a great recent example of this. 2 weeks after Russia invaded Ukraine, India accidentally launched a cruise missile at Pakistan and commented. Right? None of us read about this. I mean, some people read. It did appear. Most people haven't heard this. Now, if India and Pakistan had gone to war, we'd all be talking about all of the mistakes and the leader foibles and that. But that didn't happen, right? And this has happened innumerable times with India and Pakistan, which is that there's been lots of skirmishes. There have been some accidental missile strikes, but for the most part, this has been pretty peaceful because they have no interest in launching a war, and this was true before they were both nuclear armed, and so and we forget that because we write millions and millions of blog posts and articles and TV coverage of the wars that happen, and then so these conflicts that didn't happen, we don't write books. No one's going to write a book about the cruise missile that landed in peace.
There was. Occasionally, you do get a book like that. I mean, there are some remarkable moments of near war that there was a time the Soviets thought they were being attacked, right? And it was computer glitch, something went wrong, and someone was told to launch missiles, and that person just said, "I can't do it."
Yep.
Thank God, and they didn't launch those
There's
missiles.
There's at least two, I think, known instances of this. One I talked about in the book, which I think is the computer glitch you're talking about. Another is the story no less well, but it has to do with the nuclear submarine captain who gets bad information and then decides, no, I'm not going to do this.
Not going to rely on this. Talking about the first two reasons.
I will, one thing about that, this is true for a lot of conflict. I mean, one of the examples I bring out in the book is most of my work is working with a different level of armed groups. I studied rebel groups in Africa and different tensions there, but I spent the last 5-6 years working in Colombia around gangs and in Chicago as well, around gangs and gang violence. And in many places, it's quite similar. Medellin has a relatively low homicide rate for a city that is filled to the brim with hot-headed young men in gangs. And this is because they've built a system and found a way to sort of avoid costly conflict that keeps them, from earning drug rents and whatever else they're trying to earn. And they're political scientists. I mean, one of the political scientists who I think put all this strategic logic I've just talked about together, Jim Fearon, has a terrific article with David Layton where they look at ethnic conflict in Africa, and they look at all the ethnic groups. They sort of catalog the ethnic and Eastern Europe for that matter. So they look at all the ethnic groups that in the 1990s in Eastern Europe could have potentially fought one another because they're adjacent and they're distinct. And they did the same thing in sub-Saharan Africa. And we tend to think of these groups as sort of persistent conflict and just the perfect example of endemic violence. And they're like, actually, it's 1 in 1,000 of these groups in a given year seem to have any violent conflict whatsoever. These dyads, these sort of pairs, the 999, totally fine. And you can see that over and over and over again. So those are really important to pay attention to, right? Like, we want medics to be able to attend to the injured. And that's what medics do. And that's a really important job. But we want the larger medical profession to focus on the fact that 999 out of 1,000 people are actually pretty healthy, and not to forget that those people exist, which is, I think, what sometimes happens in this case of war.
Okay, so we have miscalculation or uncertainty. We have
I don't want to call it miscalculation because we'll get to misperception.
Oh, sorry.
But it's actually the correct calculation.
Yeah,
it's like, you can think of it as imperfect information. It's like the correct calculation. It's like there's nothing wrong with bluffing in poker, and there's nothing wrong with calling, and potentially risking that you lose, or that's your optimal strategy, right? So it's the correct calculation, and it just happens to be a risky one that leads to some potential for violence. The bluffing amidst this uncertain situation is and you don't even need bluffing. It could just be that if you both start with very different priors about relative strength, like that if Russia starts with, just use this contemporary example, with a set of beliefs about Ukrainian strength, and Ukrainians have a very different starting set of beliefs, even if neither one's bluffing, right? Even if both leaders don't even know their own capability of their own forces, which is often true, and they're just making a best guess, if their guess is different enough, right, because of the inherent uncertainty, that itself is a risk factor. And then you add in the private information and the incentive to bluff, and then the strategic calculation, and so it's the correct calculation, and that's the beauty of these insights, and I think they're really important. And so, like I said, a political economist will pick this and be like, "Oh, nothing new here. You're just telling us something we learned in the 80s and 90s." And I'd be like, "Exactly," and nobody else knows, so let's tell them about it. And then there's 3 more chapters that you guys never talk about. There's 3 other causes, and guess what? They're important too.
Well, we'll get to those, but I got to ask you one more question. I think usually when you're in a decision-making position, I never thought about this until I was president of a college. You should worry about the worst-case scenario. Most of our lives, the worst-case scenario is not that different from the best-case scenario, like dinner or the movie you choose. Okay, you didn't pick the best movie. It's not. But if you think a war is going to go 6 weeks and it goes 5 years, or if you think a war is going to go a week and it lasts a month and counting, usually you'd want to hold somebody accountable, because you'd hope there'd be a meeting where the leader would say to the chief of staff, "So what's the worst case scenario?" "Oh, 10 days. and if I were the leader, I'd want to say to them, "So if it's a month, I can execute you, right? Or put you in prison for 25 years. Oh, well, actually, it could go 6 weeks. Yeah.
And but that's exactly what happens. Yeah. But think about the calculus of the US government or the European Union right now. They are not entering this fight directly. They're using economic sanctions. They're taking some risks, arming Ukraine more and more directly. But they can see that the worst case scenario is pretty clear.
Yeah.
Right. And it's the Third World War, which what's that famous? It means that would mean the Fourth World War is fought with sticks and stones.
Yeah, exactly.
So they do see that, and so they're actually not getting involved, and that's exactly what we should think, and they shouldn't get involved, and just as Russia shouldn't have invaded Ukraine, there were better ways to do with this, because fighting's so damn costly. And so that person is listening. And that's exactly what happens. The king.
Well, hang on, I got to challenge you there. One sec. So
yeah,
I want to go back to my earlier point about they're not like me, the other side sometimes, or the side we're looking at. I don't know if this war is costly to Putin or not yet. There's a lot of deaths. I just saw a number. There's 7,000 Russian soldiers have died. I don't know if it's accurate. It doesn't matter. I listened to people reacting to a school being bombed by Putin, horror, reasonably, right? I don't know if he feels any horror. I don't know. I don't know. I don't think he goes to bed at night going, "What have I got myself into?" Is it costly to him? It could be. It's very early days to make a conclusion like that. I have no idea what they went into this thinking. What I do know is that the Russian people are really good at making very large sacrifices of human beings for war aims when they're led by an autocrat. Yeah. Stalin thought nothing, it appears, of sacrificing millions of his citizens to the German war machine. It was his defense mechanism for victory. The cost to him, I don't know if there's any cost to him. I have no idea. Was it even a sleepless night? So, I want to bring back this argument. First of all, they're not like you. Yeah. And secondly, the costs are borne by, not necessarily by the decision makers. They have some skin in the game for sure. Right. They are at risk of a coup. They're at risk of assassination. They're at risk if things go super badly. But I don't know I wouldn't say he's losing. It's not going particularly well, but I don't know if it's not going to be a success for him. It's way too early to tell.
No, 100%. And which, brings us maybe, as you know, to reason number 3, which is that if the whole point, if war is to be avoided precisely because it's costly, if the decision maker doesn't bear those costs, then, well, the decision maker usually still is going to bear some cost. There's still, the finance minister or the chancellor or the advisor is still whispering in that autocrat or king's or whatever's ear saying, "Sire, we do not have the funds to continue very long with this," and those realities are very stark. And so even then, I would argue most tyrants and autocrats and dictators and other unchecked leaders still see the bargaining space, still see that room, but sure. It narrows. And again, if all of these things, right, if the uncertainty is narrowing it and the commitment problem, the quasi-commitment problem is narrowing it, and then it gets narrowed a little bit further, and now you're down to this sliver. So I would say that's crucial. And I think it's, we talk about the democratic peace in political science, international relations, where is that no democracy is generally fought another democracy in war. And one reason for that is because these leaders are more accountable. That's my interpretation. I think that's a fair interpretation. It's, murky empirical literature, so any interpretation is possible sometimes. But democracies do go to war. Democracies go and they fight autocrats, and this is maybe a self-serving statement for democracies, but I think a lot of people who've looked at the evidence and looked at the cases say, well, it's partly because the autocrats are not internalizing the costs and have all of these other, and so the democracies are sort of put in these difficult positions where it's optimal to go to war. Now, that's not entirely true, but I think there's a lot of truth to that. And a meta comment, which maybe we'll come back to after we talk about the other lessons, is I do think it's not just, there's this thing that this bucket number 3 I call unchecked leaders, which is to say they're not internalizing costs, or they have their own private incentives to go to war, right? So Putin, the fact that Putin has this apparatus of control that he's built and his cabal, think about what's the threat of NATO to the average Russian? What is the threat of a democratic Ukraine to the average Russian? What is the threat of capitalist organization to the average Russian? Probably not that great, and arguably average Russians would all be improved by that. On the other hand, this apparatus of control, that's what's threatened by the advance of democracy or capitalism or NATO. And so this is true, I think, in a lot of cases. There's a private incentive there for the ruling cabal to turn to violence, because not just because the costs of war are not ones that they bear entirely, but actually that private incentive overwhelms the costs of war that they personally bear. And that could be enough But I mentioned there's this meta comment, which I want to come back to, which is that I think over-centralized power is maybe the most fundamental root of all conflict and warfare. And it's partly because of this. Obviously, this is mechanically, this sort of ignoring of costs, the capacity for a private incentive to go to war is in some ways a mechanical implication of the over-centralization of power. But I'd argue it accentuates uncertainty, accentuates commitment problems, and accentuates these psychological problems that I put in these next two buckets. And so it might be worth, I won't jump the gun, but I do want to remember to talk about it, because I think it's easy to think, over-centralization of power just has this narrow little effect of insulating leaders from costs, and that's true. But I think it's a much deeper and more systematic problem, and helps us understand where we're going to see conflict in the world, why we might see more, why we might see less over time.
Yeah, to quote Richard II, which we quoted recently on this program, uneasy lies the head that wears the crown. There are a lot of reasons for that.
Yeah.
And one of them is that there are people who want to take the crown away and put it on their head, and there are people who want you dead. And that's another aspect of centralization that complicates the calculus we're talking about. Let's go on to the next. What are the next two reasons?
So, the next two, I think, are gifted to us by, I think, a mix of sociology and psychology and behavioral science. And I won't say they've been ignored by the game theory and the political economy by any means, but I think they get overlooked and understudied. But the way I think about them, the way I sort of, and there's just sort of this whole mess of like psychology and reasons in the minds of leaders and the minds of the populace that they would go to war. And the way I sort of organize that actually has something to do with the way that a lot of behavioral science kind of classifies how we think and what we've learned about decision-making and psychology. And one is to say that sometimes we have stable, arguably rational preferences, things that we value. We have tastes, we have preferences, we have values, we have principles, and they're not all summed up by like how much we value that material pie. We value other things. And there's nothing irrational about pursuing those. We can value status, we can value vengeance, we can value an ideal, we can value the extermination of a competing idea or identity. And pursuing those is potentially terrible, but comprehensible. And then the second category is this whole world of misperceptions, all the human follies and mistakes, which are innumerable. We can go on and on and on. But what I tried to do, and I think what was so important, is the kinds of biases. Like if you talk to a management science person, you talk to a behavioral economist, you talk to a psychologist, they can come up with a million human foibles, and they're all relevant. And economists like us tend to focus on the ones that change market behavior and lead to suboptimal, basically bad optimization. But we're not talking about optimization, we're talking about strategic interactions with other individuals and importantly groups. And so I think you get into a whole other set of biases and misperceptions that are relevant in these strategic interactions that frankly I don't think we spend enough time as scholars focusing on. And so that, to me, those are these other two buckets which we could, if you want, we can dive into, which is one is these sort of stable preferences that are just different than what's in the material pie, and then the mistakes and misperceptions we have.
So the fourth one, this would be when I have an offer someone wants to buy my house, and he makes me an offer that's 25% higher than anybody else's, but he treats me dismissively and without respect, and he's obnoxious, and I just can't stand the idea of him living in my house, and so I don't take the highest bid. And I think some economists would call that irrational. And you're pointing out it's not irrational.
Right.
We care about things other than how much money we have.
Right.
We don't just care about how many toys and vacations and shirts. We care about our dignity and our pride and our respect. And we also, by the way, can be a little bit vengeful. So we might get a lot of pleasure from keeping that person from enjoying our house, which is sort of the flip side of what we might care about. But it's a different thing we care about with a negative sign.
Yeah. Well, maybe the biggest most often run behavioral game in human history is the ultimatum game, where you get $10, I get 0, and you have to decide how much to give me of that $10, and I can accept it or I can refuse. And if I refuse, I give up whatever you've offered me, which might be 1 penny or $3, but then you also get 0. That's the game. And we see that it varies across societies, but most people will give $2, $3, $4 on the margin, and anything less than that, most people will refuse. And so there's an equilibrium. That's why you offer more than 1 cent. And so we know that this is a pretty stable, predictable preference. And so I think, and I think that's a nice little. I think there's some ties between that and vengeance, and a desire for revenge and a desire for dignity. But you pick on something which the thing that might be irrational is that first that guy who's buying your home who treats you like dirt. That might be a mistake, right? Or maybe it's chance or so. It's hard to explain if you're going to turn to vengeance as a quote unquote stable preference, a thing that could like lead people to fight, which is extremely true. Like if you look at Jim Scott's studies of Southeast Asian, peasant uprisings, or Libby Wood's work on El Salvadorian insurgents, like this is a major reason people join fights. And it may be reasons why entire societies go to war, right? But it's certainly a huge role. And we were talking about Northern Ireland, but you kind of have to explain that first overbearing act. And that's and those can happen. I think because of those misperceptions we were talking about, and that projection bias is a good example. So there's an interaction there. But because I don't think that's the most common one. I mean, but this is one of those common things that the armchair analyst, or even I think like the casual or the policymaker, it's one we leap to, right? With you think about the current conflict, like Putin wants to be the next Catherine the Great. Putin or Russians or some segment of Russians want to return to nationalist Soviet glory, or they want status, or they want relative power. And there's a dozen stories like this. And they may all be true. I think we tend to overestimate them. But if they are true, right, this is a reason to ignore at least some of the costs. And to narrow that bargaining range further, right? That's just the mechanic. Like, yes, war's costly, but I get this other ethereal thing that I can only get through violence.
Yeah, and the buyer of my house who treats me poorly is so used to treating people that way, perhaps doesn't even think about that he might be losing the deal. He's not necessarily indulging in the thrill of demeaning someone. he could just be inept,
right?
And unaware that he's doing this. But
if you believe that some humans or most humans enjoy violence or enjoy dominance, no, I don't happen to believe that. I think it's true of some. I don't think it's true, but some people do. Then that again is this is a big bucket. This is a whole category of all these different values and preferences, and then and so it's just a logic. The bucket is like these all rhyme in the sense that they all have the same strategic logic, in that there's something that we value that we get through domination or through violence or through relative status or something that hijacks this normal incentive. And it doesn't. And then the empirical question is, well, which ones are common in lots of situations? Which ones are not actually, and maybe we overestimate. And then why do they come about sometimes and not others, right? Because that's the thing. If 999 times out of 1,000 these don't dominate, then what was it about this case or any case set of cases that led this to be dominant?
I'm going to bring that back to the personal level again.
Right.
The guy buying my house, or the interaction you have with a colleague, or the grocery cashier. Sometimes people lash out.
Yeah.
Right. And one's visceral natural reaction is either, fight or flight. Sometimes we want to, okay, is that the way you feel? I'll play, I'll fight. Or we just run away and say, that's not my thing. I don't want to, or I'm afraid, or whatever it is. But my point is that the 1 out of 1,000, the fact that it's 1 out of 1,000 is interesting in and of itself. Then if you want to explain why it's the one, it could be something you ate that morning, or this person's spouse has cancer. I mean, there are a lot of reasons that people do things that are on the outside, as you're looking in, you say, gee, that was selfish, that was cruel, that was whatever it is. And when my life isn't at stake, my default is they're having a bad day.
Yeah.
Because everyone's in a battle, so be kind. And that's where I start. Of course, when your life's at stake, it's different kind of response. But the fact that people occasionally, quote, fly off the handle, I don't think that proves that people have a taste for violence. However, I do think we have some violence in our heart, many of us, and it's sitting there. You ignite it, and it will come to life.
Well, and I agree. My day job is dealing with that in some sense, and whether it's ex-fighters in Liberia or gang members and mafia members in Medellin or street shooters in Chicago, like some of the programs and things I work on is designed to sort of tackle those that category of human error and the passions and the reactions and the so I think they're important in interpersonal violence. They're huge, they're massive, but actually I think they're not very important in this group violence. And so when I in this fifth bucket, when I talk about misperception, I didn't call it at first I was going to call it misperceptions and passions. And then I decided I actually just don't think these passions, empirically speaking, are actually that crucial for understanding why large groups go to conflict. I think those of course they matter a little bit, right? I think what really matters is the fact is when we form really persistent, erroneous beliefs about the other side. That's what I think about misperceptions and why I just sort of centered on that. I think the fundamental psychological error that individual leaders and groups make is they have these persistently wrong beliefs about the other side. And so now you think about the strategic interaction that we started with, which is that I've got to assess your strength, you've got to assess mine, including my resolve, and we've got to assess the cost of war. And any reasonable assessment of relative strength and cost of war, even if we're off a bit, we can both see that we need to go to peace. But if we are way off, like if I grossly overestimate, amidst the uncertainty, right? Because you need uncertainty to have a misperception. And so that's where the mistakes come in, right? It's like amidst this uncertainty, I draw an inference about how strong or resolved you are. That's just way off. And maybe you do the same to me. I'm overconfident, or I project my own values onto you or something. This seems to be amazingly, that kind of error is just amazingly common. And it's amazingly common in not just in war, it's amazingly common in finance, high stakes economic interactions, the decisions of CEOs. There's just huge management literatures on overconfident CEOs, overconfident,
investors,
fund managers. Yeah. It's astonishing in its persistence.
But it's a variation of the "you're not like me" challenge. I mean, I remember a lot of people I hear talking about this West, Ukraine, Russia triad say things like, well, the West will never, the fact that, they're only doing sanctions.
Yeah.
There's a lot of hawkishness among people who aren't really suited for combat, in my experience in this conversation. But they like rattling a saber that they've never touched or picked up or could imagine swinging. So that they're saying, oh, we got to do something, And then they shrug their shoulders and they opine that the West will never react. The West is soft. The West is this. The West is that. I'm thinking, that's the same mistake Hitler made. Hitler assumed Britain was soft. Of course, they were. They appeased left and right for a decade, for a long time, certainly intensely for a couple of years, as Hitler gobbled up this and gobbled up that. And Britain said, well, yeah, go ahead. And I think it misled him into thinking they'll never fight. They're rich and tired, and they were beaten up in World War I. Certainly France was, and they're not going to fight. And he was right until they did. And the same was true of the United States. I think he thought, oh, the United States, they're soft, they're democracy, they're not really, they don't have a military tradition like us. And so he would be as stupid, on the surface, seems stupid, to declare war against the United States in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor, honoring his commitment to Japan, which basically ended his life and his dreams. And because he underestimated, I think, wildly underestimated. I don't think he was an honorable man. I don't think he thought, well, I signed a treaty, I better keep it. He thought, this is a freebie. I'll tell Japan I'm in, and I'll declare war on the United States, which gave Roosevelt the opportunity to rise into war.
Yeah.
Total misunderstanding
Yeah.
of what the West was capable of, either in England or the United States. And I think that's a very common problem. It's a problem I think of it as sort of it's in finance, it's in debt, it's in war. It's like, oh, this time's different. Nothing's changed. Nothing's happened. It's costly. It's free until it isn't. And then it's like, oh my gosh, what were we thinking? And it's too late.
There's a couple things there. One is, the word appeasement is so interesting, right? It's what we call compromise when we're basically giving something away. It's what happens with a rising power, right? Like, so Germany, but it is the appeasement, if we call it that, which is just giving the whole slice, if you will, is what you do when, because of this strategic, war is costly, but if nation X rises in wealth and influence dramatically and says, guess what? We are claiming a sphere of influence. Your best move is to sort of throw your hands up and say, well, so be it. And
it's not worth it.
Well, it's not worth it. And it's actually not. It's not worth it, right? It's not worth fighting over. And that's, here's the sense in which Russia appeased, quote unquote, the West. From 1990, from a Russian point of view, I believe, I'm going to be victim to the same projection bias, but I think this is a legitimate point of view, which is to say, listen, Russia was weak in the decade or decades following the collapse of the Iron Curtain. And the United States took grand advantage of that to completely expand its sphere of influence right up to the Russian border very quickly, right? With the entry of the Baltics into NATO and so forth. So, and Russia just went, well, what are we going to do? They appeased the United States, right? And then Russia subsequently stabilized its economy, oil and gas, consolidated political control, dramatically grew its military and economic might, while places like the Ukraine completely stagnated. Ukraine has an income per capita that's actually probably lower than it was in 1990. And then it went, great, now it's our turn. We're going to push back. You guys have nicely done, can respect this, but it's our time. It's our turn to sort of get our elbows out and get back our sphere of influence. And that's, so we're going to, more or less dominate Belarus, and we're going to send our quote unquote peacekeepers into Kazakhstan, and we're going to mess around in Syria, and we're going to support the dictator there. And you're not going to do anything about it. We're going to cross red lines in Syria. And guess what? You're still not going to do anything about it. And so, so it wasn't totally unreasonable, in this sort of cold and calculating and somewhat evil sense for them to say, and thank you very much. We'll take this weak little republic next door called Ukraine, or at least demand that it's neutral. And was Putin wrong to expect that Ukraine and the West would stand up? I'm not sure. They crossed Obama's red line in Syria. Nothing was done. Steadily extended control elsewhere. I think it was amidst the uncertainty, I think it was a reasonable gamble to say, we'll just do what we did in Crimea. We'll just sort of, you're just going to wake up one morning and we're going to occupy these cities and everyone's going to throw up their hands, right? Because that, just like Hong Kong, I'm going to look at Hong Kong, and there's a very different legal basis and legitimacy, quote unquote, for what happened in Hong Kong. But we're just going to roll over, and the people of Hong Kong rolled over, and the people of Ukraine will probably roll over too. Now, I think there's also some misperception there, and surely some misperception on the Hitler side as well, and underestimating. But it's very the unity and the resolve of the West in sanctions and support for Ukraine, and the strength and the pluckiness of this resistance. I don't know that I'm sure somebody predicted this, but both of these things were kind of, I won't call them the tails of the probability distribution, but neither one of these were likely realizations of, and so we're all surprised, and Putin's surprised, and now you look at, I don't know if this will turn into a peace agreement in the next month, but the kinds of things they're sketching out and that the Turks and the Israelis say are being more or less agreed to by both sides look kind of like a split of the pie where Russia still has a substantial amount of what it wanted to obtain in the first place.
Yeah, going back to your question about improbability, what movie studio would greenlight a former comedian elevated to the presidency saying, I don't want to ride, I want weapons, when he's got a chance to run. It's improbable.
Yeah.
Definitely improbable. So you're suggesting that the opportunity for both sides to avoid further damage and cost, which, I want to remind listeners that Russia, although they've done okay since 1990 and they do have some oil and gas revenue, they're not the wealthiest country in the world. And this is a financially expensive war, even if the deaths are relatively, I didn't mean to suggest they're irrelevant. They're not irrelevant. As you point out, I think there's going to be political pressure on Putin. Even he's not a dictator.
Yeah.
Even if he isn't, call him a dictator, he has to respond. There are domestic forces that will array against him if it goes badly. And one of the ways it's going badly is it's going to cost a lot of money, and which means that people don't eat as well. And the Russians are good at dealing with that. But if they think there's no purpose to it, or it's aggrandizing one person is in love with anymore, that will be hard to sustain. So are you suggesting that with those financial costs and potential human costs that will redound onto Putin in some way, that they will find a way to end this without, in a relatively short period of time? You want to go make a prediction like that?
Well, I mean, the fact is most wars when they happen are short. So if we're just talking about unconditional probability that this will end in the next month or two, looking at the past, you have to say yes. Now, there's lots of course, except when they don't, right? And of course, we remember those. Nobody talks about, very few people remember the U.S. invasion of Haiti in '94. Very few people talk about the UK or the US.
The quagmire of the Haiti invasion. Well, didn't turn out to be a quagmire.
Yeah.
Good point.
No, before the planes even landed, the coup leader gave up, and the troops actually had to go in Sierra Leone and Liberia from the UK and the US, but then they gave up within a few months, and if not weeks, and there's just dozens of examples of this that we forget, and so most wars, when they get to this point, stop. And now, why wouldn't this one, I guess? And I do see some risks that so listen, the uncertainty is getting resolved, right? So that's there. If there was any overconfidence.
By that you mean the Russians have a much better idea of how much resistance they're going to face, and the Ukrainians have a much better idea of how damaging the Russians' attack is going to be.
Correct. And everybody's downgraded to some extent Russian military prowess, although everyone knows they still have the nukes, they still have an enormous army. Like the fact that they could dominate is not, maybe they could lose, but they're pretty strong, just less so than anyone thought before. And the unity of the West and their ability to hold sanctions, even if it wanes, as it may, has been remarkably strong. And so that all those certain variables are resolved. And so without that uncertainty, it's harder, to the extent that Putin was overconfident, which may have been one of these misperceptions, that's presumably improved as well. So all of these issues could point towards a peace agreement. And the two things that tend to lead to long wars, I think, when we look at the long run, when we look at the historical cases, I'd say the big ones are these unchecked leaders, and the private incentives that they had to fight may not have gone away, may grow. And I'll say what I mean in a minute, but also the commitment problems. Like there's a certain line of thinking, which I think is overdone, but a lot of political scientists would say that every long war was due to a commitment problem, something that just makes sense to keep fighting. And so let me take them in order. What's the private incentive? So Russians don't have an interest in continuing to fight. We all know that. They didn't really probably have an interest in their nation fighting in the first place. It was there to maintain this apparatus of control. And so the question is does Putin and this sort of cabal, wide or narrow as it may be, think it's in their interest to keep fighting or not? And if they think that giving up, if they think that fighting will be more likely to preserve themselves in power, then it can keep going. What's more, if they actually look at peace and say, actually, peace looks pretty costly now. Well, number one, all these sanctions, I'm not sure if they're going to go away. Maybe the U.S. government would wipe theirs, but all these decentralized, all these private companies, all these boycotts, all this, I'm actually not sure if any of that's going to go away. Maybe no one will buy our oil, and maybe we've lost this European customer for our oil and gas. So peace might be less attractive if we're unable to unravel this. Right? Sanctions are a form of conditional repression. They work when they're conditional. All right, and so I'm not sure if they're conditional anymore. At least some of them might not be. And then if he looks at this and says, "Oh, wait a second, the U.S. president just called me a war criminal, now they're formalizing proceedings," and that's going to make it hard for me to step down. Because if I step down eventually, even if I do it in 10 years or whatever apparatus of control I built, like I'm no longer going to be the retired statesman. There'll be some incentive for them to extradite me, or there's an added incentive for a palace coup. So does that make me more likely to settle or not? Like, we don't know. There's really complicated. So the West is doing some things that it's not obviously making peace more attractive. Where there's this famous quote from Sun Tzu who says, build your enemy a golden bridge to retreat along. I wish we were doing that. But even if absent all that, I think there's just a question about whether or not I don't even think that's first order. First order for Putin is, do I think I can hold on to power by fighting or not? And so I worry about that most of all, this private incentive to keep going. And then the commitment, I don't think the commitment problem is a fundamental root here. But if he says, listen, if I stop now, there's going to be this inevitable tilt of the Ukraine towards democracy in the West, and I push them even further. Is that a real direct threat to his regime? I'm not sure. People say it is. It's not so obvious, but let's say it is. If that's true, arming and pushing the Ukraine towards the West, if he thinks he's now made, then maybe it makes sense to keep on fighting. And that's the sense in which that's not such a persuasive story here. I think it's a persuasive story in a lot of other cases. And that's what people make an argument for the length of World War I and World War II or whatever. And then most of the time, that's not true. Neither one of these things is true most of the time, which is why in all these other cases that we don't talk about anymore, the war was actually quite short.
My guest today has been Chris Blattman. His book is called Why We Fight. Chris, thanks for being part of EconTalk.
Thank you.
This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more EconTalk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for EconTalk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.